Commissioner of City Planning for the City of Atlanta. Ryan and I met about 5 years ago, or 4 years ago, when I moved to Atlanta, and had a really meaningful connection immediately, I think. And I asked Ryan to come and work with us on Atlanta City Design, which I'm going to go through for you in just a minute. A few things before I get started. First, the presentations this morning were fantastic. I'm glad I was here for that because I learned a lot, not just about Taipei, but it was good to hear about Kevin Lynch again and see all the amazing projects that you're doing. So impressive, the design. The art and science of cities, as Ryan said, I would argue that Atlanta has been really good at the science part. This is a city that can build things. We can measure things, we can build things quickly. The question is, what are we building and why? And really, I say that because Atlanta City Design is really about more the art side of things, which I think Atlanta has a lot of work to do with. A couple things about Taipei as compared to Atlanta that I think are important. The first is that Taipei has about 3 million people, I think, right? And let's see, in 271 square kilometers or so. And Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, has 485,000 people in 350 square kilometers. So this is a low density place, and I'm going to talk more about that, but I think that's an important distinction to make. The other thing that's important, I think, in terms of my presentation, that's okay, I'll just talk. Another important distinction to make is I look at the images of Taipei, and I know Taipei just a little bit, but I see things like the river and the mountains and physical characteristics that very much define the city, and that the city is kind of being shaped by, right? You have to respond to the mountains, and you're on an island, so the land is constricted. So there's dynamics physically in Taipei that are very different than Atlanta. Atlanta is a city in this country that has been known as a sprawling city that is not building at its center. It's quite the opposite. Okay. Thank you. Well, here's Atlanta. So Atlanta doesn't have those dramatic physical characteristics. You know, we're part of the Piedmont. There are aspects of that. There are the rivers, the Chattahoochee River, the South River to the south. We are on the what is it called? Why am I forgetting this? The Intercontinental Divide, where the water flows to the Gulf of Mexico on the west side of the city and to the Atlantic Ocean on the east side. There's interesting things, but you need to be a scientist to know these things. You know, when you're in Taipei, you don't need to be a scientist to know there's mountains over there, right? So Atlanta does lack these physical characteristics that define us. And we thought it was, Ryan and I, and frankly Mayor Reed at the time, thought it was important that we, at this time in the city's history, that we try to create some physical identity around which Atlanta can grow, and that the physical attributes of the city can be accentuated as we become a much larger city. So that's what I'm going to get into. And this relates to the Kevin Lynch thing too. You know, the imageability of the city. I love that in your map of the city. And Atlanta, and you think these things are kind of academic in a way, but they're not. You know, the people experience these things personally, whether they realize it or not. And some of the reasons we did it. So more about Atlanta. So the city's population was about almost 500,000 people in 1970 when the region's population was 1.8 million. Today, the city's population is a little less than that. It's 485,000 people in a region of 6 million. So those numbers define our challenge. We have occupied the land in a way that is very difficult to serve, you know, and to create places of distinction and frankly a public realm. We've spread over the landscape, and that's Atlanta's place. And that happened over the last generation of growth, right? Right after the Second World War, until you could argue the Great Recession, of about 2008, 2009. That's the period of that kind of growth in this country, and Atlanta was really good at it. The next generation of growth we think needs to be different. As Ryan said, it's expected the region will grow to 8 million people over the next generation of growth, and we wanted to decide how big a city should we be designing for, so we got a demographer who's really smart about these things to help us think about this. And he suggested that Atlanta should aspire to absorb 25%, just 25% of that growth. If we were able to, we'd become a city of 1.2 million, which Atlanta has never been. That would be a kind of growth that the city and region has never experienced. Just 25% of that growth. Today, the city's population is less than 10% of the region. If we were able to achieve this, we'd become about 15% of the region. Still very small numbers, but it would be really a radical change for this place. Part of the idea here, and this is what Ryan and I were really exploring with this thing, and luckily, Mayor Reed really cared about this, but not that much. He cared about it, but he just kind of said, y'all go do your thing, have a ball. He did like doing things differently, things that other cities weren't doing, and cities aren't really much doing this in America. We wanted to say, we're planning the city, but we're also designing it. And in Atlanta's case, we think this is especially important. And so this one scale of design is the whole city scale, that 135 square miles. We think about designing buildings and parks, but we said we think we need to think about first designing the city at the whole scale of the city. And this is somewhat in the spirit of, one could argue, the best era of city planning in America, which is the early 20th century. This is an image from the Chicago Plan of 1909. And I reference it because in the early 20th century, American cities were planning or designing like this. This is the most well-known. And Chicago at the time, think about Chicago, they had the Great Fire of 1871. Much of the city was burned. They had the World's Fair of 1893, where they tried to present a different Chicago to the world. Chicago at the time was a pretty rough place. It had been a slaughterhouse prairie town, very important in its location, but a rough place. And the business community of Chicago wanted to show the world that it was not that. It was a city of sophistication, of quality. And so they commissioned Daniel Burnham and Edward Bennett to do this design for Chicago. And it really changed the city. This is the plan that called for the Lake Michigan waterfront to be public, for the Chicago River to be public. Not that much of it was frankly implemented. Now the lakefront was, and now the Chicago River is, and some of the main avenues were built. And the point is that it really shaped the city forever. So the Chicago River is just being made public more than 100 years after this plan. And we recognize that in city planning, we are the only instruments of government, really, that are asked to think about the city 5, 10, 20, 30 years in the future. No one else has that responsibility. And so we can't keep using the techniques that we've been using in this country that have been so ineffectual. And so we're trying to explore a different technique, and that's what Atlanta City Design was. We produced it through a very public process that Ryan Gravel led, asking the residents of Atlanta to help us understand what makes Atlanta different than other cities. Not what ideas can we borrow from other cities, which Atlanta, frankly, had kind of been in the practice of doing. They do it in LA, so we should do it in Atlanta or here or there. No, let's not do that. Let's try to understand this city, what makes it different and unique, and let's try to design the city such that it's those unique qualities that we're bringing forward as we grow as a city. Ryan was the one that suggested in late 2016 that the concept around this plan be built on Dr. King's notion of the beloved community, which honestly there were a lot of people, even in Atlanta at the time, that weren't very familiar with this, but it was that the civil rights movement, the nonviolent struggle that this group of people was leading in this country, The outcome they were seeking was the beloved community, a diverse group of people living together, caring and loving for their place. And that's how we developed the concept, and Ryan in particular. It also included a set of principles. This is a 400-page book, by the way, so I'm showing a few images here and kind of quickly going over some high-level aspects of this, but it's very deep. And each of these principles, which again are unique to Atlanta, they're principles that you sometimes don't see in planning documents, but that's because Ryan was challenging residents of Atlanta to really understand what is the personality of this city and how do we make recommendations around the city's growth that has to do with that personality. Physically, we broke it down into this: designing for people, designing for nature, and people in nature. Taking the city as a whole and breaking it down basically into growth areas. The idea here is that on the left, these gold areas are the places where the city should get much denser. The population, the height should be taller. This is the urban part of the city, most especially the core of the city. Downtown Atlanta is a place where you might argue 10,000 people live. That would be generous. 10,000 people in a region of 6 million in the downtown. There should be hundreds of thousands of people in downtown. And what can we do to unlock the potential of our downtown, but also these corridors that come out from the city? And then on the right, conservation areas. Atlanta is a city of many relatively low-density neighborhoods. A fairly compact core that gets to somewhat urban, suburban, and even rural neighborhoods, and that's the areas on the left here, which we call conservation districts. This, however, is the physical DNA of the city. This is the most developed corridor that we have coming out of the core of the city. This is Peachtree Street, looking north from Midtown towards Buckhead, and it's by no means perfect. It's just that this is the city's armature. You know the grid of Chicago, you know the organic nature of Boston, you know the high design of Washington, D.C., the uniqueness of San Francisco. All those places have their unique physical layout. And this is Atlanta's. Whether we like it or not, this is what we have, which is the compact core, streets that come out from it, follow the topography, or sometimes go over it. And this is where we're seeing density. And then adjacent to them are these relatively low density, tree canopied neighborhoods that you see here. But that's all over the city. This is to the northwest, Hollowell Parkway, neighborhoods adjacent to a commercial street, somewhat industrial street, Hollowell Parkway, and again, neighborhoods, similar conditions. On the south side of the city, Metropolitan Parkway, Pittsburgh, Adair Park, Sylvan Hills, all these neighborhoods adjacent to it, relatively. If you go to Metropolitan Parkway today, it's a lot of low-density commercial, shopping center, distribution type uses. Honestly, Peachtree Street not that long ago was mostly shopping centers with parking lots, single 2-story buildings. Over a relatively short period of time, it really became dense and as urban a place as you have in the South. So we need to recognize that's the kind of growth that we need to facilitate and make better. Make what's happening within this DNA as good as it possibly can be. And how do we do that? The people part of it was that we need to understand these streets as the public realm of the city. They're not simply highways. If you go on our streets, you'll see that we did everything we could possibly do to give them to the cars. And that we have to go back now, and the only future we have that will be satisfying to us is if we go back to these streets and make them for people as well. That we're designing the city for legibility. Atlanta is a very confusing place, and yet it has these centers that we never think about legibly connecting. We do what we can to confuse you with the way we connect our streets and our transit system, and that we need to recognize that the legibility of the city is very important. And again, that we're designing for public life. The Beltline has given us a whole new framework for connections between neighborhoods and how our streets are intersecting with the Beltline and creating a level of connectivity that the city's never had before. Designing for nature is a combination of things. protecting the Chattahoochee River to the northwest and the South River to the southeast, making parks and public spaces in those locations. They're very different. Then connecting those areas in our parks through our system of creeks and watersheds. Some of that work is happening now, Proctor Creek, Peachtree Creek, but we set up a whole system of these kinds of connections. And then protecting the tree canopy. This is really, for me, this is the Lake Michigan waterfront for Atlanta. So what distinguishes Atlanta as a city? And it is the potential that you can live in a very urban place, as urban certainly as there is in the south of the United States, and yet have access to nature. And that if we do both parts of that really well, the urban part in the ways you might think, related to the walkability and vibrancy and beauty of our streets, we do that really well. But then also we're protective of nature, and nature can thrive and be repaired in this process, that we will create a city that is very unique and unlike any other American city if we do them both well, and we have to celebrate where those connections are. So we did the Atlanta city design at the city scale. We commissioned this poster here because we felt like people needed to have an image that they could see and appreciate, whether they understood it or not. At least it's aesthetically beautiful. No one's going to read a 400-page book, as we know, but they like posters. So now, and this was a good move because this poster is now in every city council member's office, and they don't know what it is necessarily, but they say, we like that. They're constantly saying to us, even in our budget hearings, what does the planning department need to make sure that happens, whatever that is. So it was a good idea. This is the web address, however, for the 400-page book, if you care to look at it. Then we said, okay, so that was phase one, design at the city scale. We need to start focusing on other scales of design and make this happen. So among the things we've been focused on are transportation. We did a new transportation plan coming out of city design, which focused on moving people from car travel to other modes. And what we say to everyone, because it's the truth, is that the only way Atlanta can be a healthy place is if less people have to drive so much. And this is an imperative for the city. And again, this isn't my opinion. It's not a planning principle. It's a public service announcement that if we do not do this, then we will not succeed. And here's an example of this. So Atlanta typically is in the top 10 cities in the world for congestion. Often we're number 8. And you can look this up, it's actually true. And often we're between Paris and London on the list. So people often tout how terrible it is that we're number 8. And I always say, I think it's awesome, because look at who we're between. The issue isn't the congestion, because every city has congestion. Taipei has massive congestion. Every great city is completely choking in traffic. That's not the issue. The issue is, what else do they have? And what I say to people is, if you focus on congestion, you will never be satisfied. This has been proven time and again in cities over millennia. You, however, can get great satisfaction by changing your streets and making them for people and bikes and trams and these kinds of things. You will have great success if you do that. This is a big challenge, though. Taking down the highway in Taipei, especially for a mayor that's only got 8 years, is amazing. That just means that you've got to actually take the bridge down in 6 days. I mean, that's how quickly you got to move. That's amazing. I love that. The other thing we focused on is housing affordability and diversity, because in America and in Atlanta, in the mid-20th century, in our case it was 1980, we made this kind of diversity illegal through our zoning regulations. And so we're having to go back in. Most of our neighborhoods traditionally had these small apartment buildings, like you're seeing on these images. We made them illegal, so we're going back in and making them legal again. We can achieve an incredible amount of density and affordability just by reforming our zoning code and allowing people to build. That's a huge issue in Atlanta. And I want to talk just for a minute to close it out on the public realm. So we have design at the city scale, and we have the big city scale. We also know we have a lot of work to do on our streets and our buildings. This is an image of downtown Atlanta. This is basically a military diagram from 1958 as to how they would get cars flushed in and out of downtown Atlanta as fast as they could. And so they widened the streets. Here's one of the streets that believe it or not, this is a street in the city. And it's actually in the midst of Georgia State University. So this picture was taken right after I got to Atlanta. The students hadn't come back to school yet. On most days, there's hundreds of kids walking this, but yet we allow this because this was all about getting cars in and out of the city. And so we recognize that if we do not address this issue and switch these one-way highways, because in Atlanta you got big highways, you got medium-sized highways, you got little highways. We got every highway of any size you could possibly want. And so we've got to go in and strategically change this such that we create an environment that produces the kind of vitality we're looking for. So what we focused on is this area, which is the one issue in Atlanta is what's the center of the city? That's, thinking about imageability of the city, I'd love to just ask people the question, where is the center of Atlanta? And just have them put it on the map, You'll get all kinds of answers, I'm sure. The reality is Peachtree Center in downtown has traditionally been the center. This is an image from the 1960s when there was for various reasons, there was an effort to take pedestrians off the streets. So we have all these above ground walkways that connect all the buildings. So it was a very intentional taking of the pedestrian off the street, which means that the life of the street has been deadened. It's very difficult to overcome that. So we focused on that very same little geography there, and we proposed to build a shared street in the Peachtree Center. Exhibition Road in London is our model for this. And we're into engineering on this thing right now, but we want to make it a street for everyone. And so that's one aspect of it, is to go to the center. This is another small piece. This is Broad Street, where the city had technically pedestrianized this block, closed it to traffic, but in true Atlanta fashion, you could still drive there. I'm not sure how that works. But anyway, Mayor Reed said, can we please do something more permanent here? So we designed this demonstration of how to make a plaza out of the street, and it was executed just before Mayor Reed left office, and this is an image from the New York Times. They took a photograph here of this young actress. Now we're working with MARTA on this major investment they're making in transit. The issues that were presented that are on the forefront of the plan for Taipei are the very same issues that we're working on. Transit investments, housing affordability, regeneration, these kinds of things. This is the center station of our MARTA station, our MARTA system, which is a 5-point station. We're working closely with MARTA. And what we're suggesting is we need to look at some other cities in terms of these major crossroads stations like Metro Center in Washington, D.C. The thing about this station in Metro Center in Washington is that you get access to the metro through the buildings. There's really no train station there. You get access through the buildings. There's simply the sign here. This is Market Street in San Francisco, same condition in the sense that that street cuts a diagonal through the city, and the transit stations appear at these plazas along Market Street. So they're very subtle, and then you get your access to the station below. Or in Paris, same situation, where the station itself is below the public space. So you have the public green here, the square, with these beautiful buildings surrounding it. And the way you get access to the station is through the head house here to the right. Beautifully designed, but bringing together multiple. So we think we need to think similarly about the 5-point station. This is the World Trade Center site in New York City, and the Fulton Center transit building that they built, but it was a part of a larger redevelopment after the World Trade Center. And so here's the World Trade Center block to the left, pre-9/11. So what happened was, of course, that whole block was developed in the late middle part of the 20th century, and they cut off all these lower Manhattan streets and created a super block there. So when they went back in to redesign the site, they actually restored the blocks of the city. So they brought Greenwich Street back through, they brought Fulton Street across. They actually went from one big block to 5 small blocks. And actually that repair of the urban fabric of the city was the most important move urbanistically. Then they could work within these blocks to build the memorial, to build other public space, but also to build the Millennium Tower and other things. So this is our 5-point center station in downtown Atlanta, and we think we need to do a similar thing here. Evaluate the fabric of the city, and most importantly, repair that fabric where we can, such that the investment we're making in transit is really, to Ryan's point about making a place where people can live and be happy. And the last thing I'll mention is design as it relates to architecture, and I'm embarrassed almost to even talk about this after looking at Taipei, but Atlanta is not a city known for architecture. Let me just say that. But we do think it's critically important that we have higher standards when it comes to these things. And we knew we'd have to get into this at some point with developers, having done city design and said how critical the public realm is and design and architecture is. So this was our chance. This was about 2 years ago. Someone had proposed to build a building here at Ponce and Peachtree Street on a surface parking lot at an intersection that includes some of the most historic buildings in the city, the Fox Theater, the Georgian Terrace Hotel, the Ponce Apartments, all from the early 20th century, that we have higher standards when it comes to these things. And we knew we'd have to get into this at some point with developers, having done city design and said how critical the public realm is and design and architecture is. So this was our chance. This was about 2 years ago. Someone had proposed to build a building here at Ponce and Peachtree Street on a surface parking lot and an intersection that includes some of the most historic buildings in the city, the Fox Theater, the Georgian Terrace Hotel, the Ponce Apartments, all from the early 20th century. They wanted to build on this surface parking lot, so they came to us and said, we think we got a really good idea for this. How about that? So they it met all the zoning and was fine to go. They were ready to go, and we just said, we think it's probably best if we don't build insulting buildings in Atlanta. we just think that's a problem. So here's what happens in this case is the developer then comes in with a big team of lawyers because they legally have a right to do this. They're following the zoning, but we're just saying you can't do it. I mean, I understand you have the right to, but how dare you? So they come in with a big group of lawyers. Usually you have 2 meetings with lawyers, and then after that second meeting, the developer realizes the lawyers can't redesign the building, because that's what we're talking about. This is not a legal issue. This is you're not going to have contempt for our city issue. You are going to get a better architect and design something that we won't hate seeing for the rest of the time. So anyway, we sat down with them and we suggested this is what you ought to. We didn't say build something completely different. We just said let's understand the basics of architecture and what would make a building that people would appreciate and would enhance the public realm. And we got into looking at other buildings and materials and all those kinds of things. And so this is what resulted from that. So we were really pleased with this, and this was the first building we did. We're now into our 6th building like this. The meetings with the lawyers and all that. And then the architects come in and we fix it. But I think that all of those scales are important, especially in Atlanta's case, because the city is starting with a lack of imageability, a lack of, and it's important. It's not just a frivolous thing, as I said. It's really about the success of the city, because in many ways, when residents of the city see things being built that diminish their life, whether it's a street or it's a building that they find to be insulting or ugly, then they get angry. They say, we don't want growth anymore, because when I see growth, I see bad things happen. And so this is critically important to the city's success, because resident support for and embracing of density and affordability depends in part about the success we have when it comes to design. I often say that it can be the difference between success and failure in design. I know a town that was adjacent to Charleston that I used to work in, the town had done a plan. It took them 7 years. They did a plan for their main street. Then they created zoning to create density and affordability and all these kinds of things. They spent 7 years on a plan and zoning and all that. The first building that someone built was so terribly designed that the community said, we will never allow that to happen again. And they went back and undid the zoning and the plan. All that work was gone because when they saw it, they hated it. So you have to be careful about these things. And not only that, Atlanta's in competition with Charlotte, and Atlanta's in competition with Nashville and Dallas. And everyone is competing on some level in the area of urban fabric and vitality and beauty. And these cities are recognizing that. And Atlanta needs to, or it's going to fall behind and not be successful. So thank you for giving me this chance to present this. And